BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, and thanks for listening to the Farming Today podcast. I'm Caz Graham, and coming up in this episode, fancy some Oxfordshire okra, or maybe a locally produced UK orange. We'll be hearing about the crops British farmers will grow in the future as our climate gets warmer. First, though, it is 5 years this week since the UK left the EU. For farmers, that meant goodbye to the old EU Common Agricultural Policy and the beginning of a transition to new policies drawn up by the different UK nations since agriculture is devolved. Direct payments to farmers based on the amount of land they farm are being phased out in England and Wales, but retained to some extent in Scotland and Northern Ireland. And all of the new support schemes broadly reward farmers for environmental work, things like habitat restoration, carbon capture and flood alleviation. So, how is it all going? That's what we're going to be asking all through this week with reports from farms across the UK. To kick us off, I've been speaking to Professor Ludovine Petittin from Cardiff University's School of Law and Politics.
Scotland and Northern Ireland have decided to keep direct payments. Obviously, this could lead to an issue of competition between two nations who keep direct payments and the two who don't. But this is why what we see in practice is that when you looked at the nitty-gritty of the SFI and the Sustainable Farming Scheme in Wales, they're actually very close to, what can be classified as direct payments with, do's and don'ts, so actions that farmers have to undertake.
Are the new schemes that are up and running, are they actually delivering what they're supposed to? And how will that be measured?
So England is the nation that is the furthest along, and across the other three nations, it's just starting. So is the SFI mostly successful? So it's not...
The SFI, that's the Sustainable Farming Incentive.
The uptake so far is around 40%, which is quite good for such a new scheme. And farmers seem to be happy with the length of scheme, which is around 3 years, sometimes 5. They're also generally happy with the level of payments, which has changed. In terms of the environmental impact, it's quite early on to say that, but, a lot of the actions are meant to improve the environment with, no-till or having cutting and grazing later on in the summer to enable, wildflowers and grasses, so it's quite positive, I think, overall.
Some farmers have been dissatisfied with the implementation of the new schemes. They're concerned that they're too slow and that money is not forthcoming. Do you think they've got a point there?
Yes. If you think about the SFI in particular, the fact now that there are over 100 actions that, farmers can be paid for, this is not really simplifying or cutting the red tape of farmers to know, what they do or shouldn't do, because it's getting quite confusing. And of course, we have also seen that some schemes all of a sudden had to be stopped. So I think this is all creating uncertainties also for farmers in terms of what financial support can they get.
And what about international trade? Leaving the EU meant leaving a large established marketplace, and farmers have been unhappy about new trade deals with Australia and New Zealand, for example. How would you assess the impact that leaving the EU has had on UK farming from a trade perspective?
It's much more difficult for them to export because of the non-tariff barriers that have been put in place. So these have added so much paperwork. And of course, the new government is looking at resetting the UK-EU trading relationship and looking at a veterinary agreement. So an SPS agreement is definitely part of that, but so is looking at what are called technical barriers to trade. So things like traceability, labeling, and how could these be smoothed would be also very beneficial to the farming community.
That's Professor Ludovine Petittin from Cardiff University. Now, barley is grown in more than 100 countries around the world for human food, animal feed, and for malting barley for drinks like beer and whiskey. But like all crops, it's vulnerable to the changing climate. Developing more resilient types of barley is a key focus for Scotland's brand new £30 million International Barley Hub, where scientists are exploring the genetic diversity found in their collection of ancient barley varieties for the traits that could be beneficial on modern farms. Nancy Nicholson has been to Dundee to meet the Hub's Deputy Director, Dr. Tim George, who took her into their refrigerated vaults.
So what we're looking at here is hundreds of different varieties of barley, each one kept in a small packet in these large metal trays, which keep them in the perfect conditions for making sure that they're viable for a long time.
Will we go out of here? Because
Sure.
not only is it very cold, it's quite
Noisy.
noisy as well. We'll go into another of these labs. So these little brown packets of seeds could hold some of the answers to the big issues we're facing.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're like little treasure troves of diversity and traits and genes that have been left behind by our forebears over the last 10,000 years. And we've picked them up, we look after them, we protect them, and then we utilise them to give us the benefits that we need for the future.
How soon might farmers be able to benefit from the work that's being done here?
They're coming through the pipeline all the time, so there are some things that are very close to market right now, so there may be benefits seen in the next couple of years, but there are things that we are starting to understand at the scientific level now which may take a decade to come to market.
Well, I've popped over to the more industrial part of the building where the seed is cleaned and prepared. Kelly Houston's a geneticist who's looking at barley's nutritional qualities for human food, and we don't use it as much as some other countries, do we, Kelly?
No, we don't commonly consume that much barley as human food in the UK or in Europe as a whole. However, some countries such as Ethiopia and Tibet, barley is actually one of the staple crops of their diet, and so it's really important to make sure that the barley that's grown there and consumed by those people has as much nutritional content as possible. Also, a lot of people all across the globe don't consume enough dietary fibre, which is really important to maintain human health. And barley is actually an excellent source of beta-glucan. It has 10 times more beta-glucan on average than wheat or rice. And we've been doing a lot of work to understand the genetics underpinning this aspect of the barley grain as well.
So what's the potential of what you're doing here then? Is it to encourage more use of the plant in future for human use?
Absolutely. So there's a massive potential to start incorporating flour derived from barley into loaves which are predominantly made by wheat. So you can use flour mixes of 10% barley with 90% wheat and still potentially get that benefit from the high levels of barley beta-glucan.
Kelly Houston ending that report from Nancy Nicholson. A warming climate will bring difficult challenges to farmers, but also new growing opportunities. So could we see commercial orange groves, fields of okra, chickpeas maybe? A new study from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, along with the University of East Anglia, predicts that we might, although not for a few decades. They've been investigating the future suitability of more than 160 existing and new food crops for different parts of the UK under warming scenarios of 2 and 4 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial times. The report's author, Dr. John Redhead, told me what could be on the menu.
Things like chickpeas and lentils, soybeans, and then some of the more Mediterranean crops like even citrus fruits like oranges. And then some things from further away as well, so some things like okra as well, some slightly more exotic crops too.
Well, there are farmers who are already trialling new crops that might well be suited to a different, warmer climate. Charlotte Smith visited Pete Thompson back in 2022.
I've got my biggest, warmest winter coat on, as well as a big jumper, because it's really cold. Who in their right mind would plant an olive grove here?
Does make a lot more sense on a sunny day, doesn't it? We are a very dry part of the country and we get above average temperatures. So when you're looking at where we can go with cropping, this was an obvious place to try.
And does it work?
We've picked olives off this grove for 3 out of the last 4 years. We're never going to grow a big, fat, juicy Halkidiki or Gordal or something like that, but I think we can produce something that has still got a place.
Pete Thompson with his Essex olive grove. So, I mean, it is already happening. Those olives, people are growing chickpeas too.
Yeah, and that's fantastic to hear. And that's one of the things we were really reassured when we ran these computer models, is the crops that they were suggesting were likely to do well under climate change are these ones that we know farmers are already experimenting with, the chickpeas, the haricot beans, the citrus fruits, the olives. That's actually likely to become much more commercially viable for a wider range of farmers to fit these crops into their current rotations, in amongst their current farming practices.
Are there any crops that we might not be able to grow if average temperatures rise by 2 or, say, 4 degrees?
So actually, under a 2-degree scenario, there are very few crops that show a blanket decrease in suitability across the UK. What you instead get is this big polarisation where things like wheat, barley, potatoes, onions, some of our big staple crops, drop in suitability in the south and east, but the climate actually gets better and more suitable for them as you go further north and west. So on average, they look like they're doing okay. Of course, the challenge there is we currently grow most of our food in the south and east.
We've just heard that report about barley, about scientists looking to breed more climate-resilient crops. Isn't it more likely that we're just going to stick with the crops that we know, but make changes to them, like we're hearing about there, so that they can cope as the climate changes?
That is one really important way of doing things. The challenge with that is climate change is happening fast, and there is always the possibility that we simply run out of road with taking that approach.
Which aspects of climate change do you think will have the biggest impact on agriculture? We're seeing far more extreme weather events nowadays. Lots of farmers will be waking up this morning with an awful lot of clearing up to be done after Storm Eowyn.
Yeah, and that is one of the real challenges with climate change. It is likely to be these extreme events. We need to work on making our model more responsive to those. So our model is good at predicting what's the impact of an average year, but we don't seem to be having average years anymore. And lots of our really poor years in terms of crop yields haven't been because of direct physical impacts on the plant. They've been because the farmers can't get out onto the land to manage their crops properly in the first place. It might be climatically suitable for a particular crop, but if your land's underwater and you can't get out there to cultivate or sow, that doesn't really help.
Dr. John Redhead. And that's all from us for this morning. I'm Caz Graham. The producer is Heather Simons, and Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.